Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Presswood, and I am here with LGC Axio Proficiency Testing to welcome all of you to this session entitled Protecting Your Customers and Brand, Actionable Steps to Prevent Undeclared Allergen Recalls. Today, your speaker is Dr. Joe Baumert, who is the co-director of the Food Allergy Research and Resource Program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Baumert will take a deep dive into the root causes of allergen-related recalls and delve into the gaps in allergen management and labeling. As mentioned, I'm here with LGC Proficiency Testing, and I was thrilled to introduce this topic as it's one that LGC also finds very important. We have significantly expanded our allergen PT samples this year to respond to the industry's need for accuracy in this type of testing. So make sure to visit us in the Community Exchange if you'd like to learn more. And on a personal note, I'm also very passionate about this topic as I come from a family with several life-threatening food allergies. So I'm very excited to hear what Dr. Baumert has to say today. If you have questions, please put them in the comments section and use the question mark icon. And be sure to stick around for the post-session chat where you'll small groups so you can meet each other and share perspectives on the session. And with that, over to you, Dr. Baumert.
Well, thank you, Jessie. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about food allergens and some of the root cause of those recalls that we often hear about, unfortunately. But I think it's important to put it all in perspective of what we're looking at from priority allergens onto some of those causes for recalls. And then, of course, what can we do? What can we learn from those issues and move forward as an industry to help prevent food allergy recalls and those risks to consumers? So today, I want to start off by putting us all into perspective on food allergens. And, again, depending on which jurisdiction we may have food product in and which ones we're talking about, there can be differences amongst those priority allergens that require source allergen labeling. So here in the United States, we have the Food Allergy Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, or FALCPA, which was enacted in 2004, which really brought about the legislation to define those major allergens, the so-called Big 8 allergens that you see at the bottom left panel. With that, of course, it not only brought about the need to label, but also brought about the need to think about how we control cross-contact and minimize the opportunity for unintended allergen presence to be in food products that aren't labeled as containing the allergenic ingredient. In the US, it's very noteworthy that as of January of 2021, we had the passing of the FASTER Act, which amongst several items included sesame as the 9th priority allergen that requires source allergen labeling. So the industry is now working towards bringing those allergen control programs along to have sesame included where the sesame allergy may be a risk of cross contact. So we're thinking about how we update those control programs, how we update labeling and so forth. So that's FASTER Act, and the enforcement of sesame as a priority allergen certainly comes into effect January 1 of 2023, as I've indicated on the bottom left corner as well. Looking elsewhere, we see that there are differences in some of the legislation around the world, and many of them center around those Big 8 allergen sources, which were part of the Codex Alimentarius guidance list from back in the 1990s. Additionally, there's been some additional allergens that have been included. So those allergenic sources such as mollusk and shellfish, mustard, sesame were included in the Canadian priority allergen list. And you see derivations across the world dependent upon, in part, what some of those different exposures are to those food sources, some of the differences in consumption patterns and so forth. So that predicates the need to know exactly what the different labeling laws are in the various jurisdictions around the world where those food products may be marketed. So today, of course, we want to talk about some of the risks associated with food allergy and the focus with food industry and where we can implement strategies to help minimize those risks. But I think it's always important to put us in context and just keep us in a reminder that we're all here to ensure the safety of our consumers, especially in this context, allergic consumers that would react to otherwise nutritious food sources for the vast majority of individuals. So we see nutritious food sources that I listed prior, such as milk, egg, peanut, and so forth, that can cause severe and life-threatening reactions to allergic individuals on occasion. And again, we have to do our due diligence as an industry to assure that we're minimizing that opportunity for an adverse response. So because of the acute nature of food allergy and allergic reactions and the potential for severe and unfortunately even fatal type reactions, it's really brought about an awareness and an urgency amongst the industry as well as regulatory agencies. Due to that, we have seen regulatory enforcement of different allergens, those big 8, soon to be big 9, or top 9 allergens here in the US that, again, require that source allergen labeling. And per the Food Safety Modernization Act, also require proper management through allergen control programs, which we'll discuss later. So we're going to think about in the next several slides where some of those regulatory risks occur in association with those recalls and reportable food registries. There's also, of course, the business risk, and none of us want to end up in that area where we're putting anyone at a health risk, but certainly we don't want to put the business at risk from the perspective of a costly recall. So what can we do to help minimize that opportunity, ensure the safety as well? So let's dive into some of the area around what we know from a regulatory perspective on food allergen recalls and reports. And I show a slide here that kind of summarizes the reportable food registry that is utilized to enter in when a company believes that they have a reasonable probability that there's a exposure that could cause that serious adverse health consequence or death. So there's a requirement to, once you have that risk analysis in place, have that notice that there is a potential for that serious adverse health consequence. You enter into the system for FDA's review on next steps in the process. So over the last several years, the FDA has issued summary reports starting in the 2009-2010 sequence, and have data all the way up to the 2014 reporting timeframe as well. And you can see from this graph on the right panel that we're really seeing continuously allergens rising to the highest level of reportable food registry entries into the system. Again, showing that food allergies are a key challenge that we must continue to improve upon. So if we then look at a little bit of deeper dive and look at the 2013-14 registry, but this holds true for several of those other ones as well. Let's take a look at what's causing those. And of course, those food allergens and undeclared allergens are causing a big proportion of those reportable food registry entries. And what we're seeing there is that we have a continued increase of the number of entries related to food allergens and those undeclared allergen issues year over year from 2013 to 2014. 2013-2014 reporting. So again, we're seeing a 43.6 to 47% increase in the total number of entries overall. So a slight increase year over year for food allergies, and they continue to be the #1 cause of these entries as well. It's always important to take a look at what's causing it in the areas that are having those challenges. And we see bakeries, cookies, muffins, cakes, perhaps, as listed in the reports and confections, accounting for a large proportion of the entries as well. So again, areas where there's various cleaning and other type of challenges. We also monitor on our side, to the best of our ability, different recalls that take place. So beyond the entries that go into the RFR reports, we look at those food FDA and USDA recalls and alerts that are posted and monitor over time what we're seeing. And I'm providing the summary area and summary number of reported recalls that have taken place for FDA and USDA inspected product. Of course, we see often more related recalls from the FDA side because we're dealing with a lot more of the different priority allergens and usage collectively from that sector of the industry. USDA, where we're focused primarily on meat, poultry, and eggs, we're seeing those recalls take place in those further enhanced and type of products that introduce some of these priority allergens as well. You'll note a couple of spikes that we saw in the data, and we'll talk a little bit more about those because I think those are noteworthy in discussion of why we saw such a spike in the 2014, 15, and 16 timeframe. Nonetheless, we're seeing overall a trend which follows suit to the RFR reports, in which we're seeing a high level of food allergen related recalls year over year. And again, we're going to look to see where we can learn from the past and what improvements can be made. So with that, there was a nice study conducted by Steve Gendel when he was with the FDA and colleagues that looked at where they had identified different causes of recalls from the FDA side. And in this context, they saw evaluation of 732 food allergen recalls. Again, let's take a deeper dive on what may be causing the recalls and where we're seeing those. And similar to what we see with the RFR reports, we see bakery, snack, candy, dressings, dairy type products where we see the majority of class 1 type recalls associated with food allergens and undeclared allergen residue. So kind of mirrors what we see with some of those other reports. But I think it's then important to see which allergens might be contributing. And in this time frame, when he looked from about 2007 to 2012, we were seeing that milk, wheat, and soy were some of the predominant allergens associated with those recalls. And not surprising, as these are often used as ingredients in different formulations of products, often produced in shared facilities. In addition, you'll see peanuts as being one of the ones that have caused a spike that I mentioned earlier. Last point I think is always important is, where did we see these recalls? What were the root causes? And this is always a challenging area to determine, as there's often not a lot of information that gets to that level of specificity in these recall notices or alerts. So where possible, Dr. Gendel did take a look at what caused some of these different recalls. And where we saw the highest level of or number of recalls was associated with the wrong package or product in the wrong package or the wrong label applied to that package. Where we often spend a lot of time is in that area of controlling cross contact, and we focus a lot of our efforts in the industry on that. And we're seeing a lot lower number of recalls that were attributed in this particular study to cross contact issues. So I think where we've provided a lot of effort is in that area, and we've been able to mitigate cross contact. But some of the areas that can be overlooked certainly is in that area of packaging and labeling. And that's certainly an emphasis area that was highlighted in the Food Safety Modernization Act associated with the allergen portion of that of the document. In addition, we tried to take a deeper dive at some newer recall information. and we've partnered with FMI on trying to evaluate where we could see some of those root causes for allergens. And similar to what Dr. Gendel found in his review of the FDA records, was that there were, again, limited information, but where we had information, we often saw a similar response, in which we saw incorrect ingredients or an ingredient statement that contributed to the recalls that were associated. So a failure to declare a sub-ingredient, errors at the label supplier can also, if you think of that as a portion or an ingredient type to your overall production, that caused some of the recalls. Old labels used new formulations. So again, getting to the point of some of the challenges with some of the resource control, and of course, using that unlabeled or old label that may have not declared that allergen is certainly would be grounds for recall, of course. And then different product sizes that had different allergen profiles. So again, some of those multi-pack issues were some of the challenges. Wrong product and package was certainly one of the key areas that we often saw in our survey as well, where we saw packaging that wasn't changed from a subsequent product. So you had a short run of a product that went into the wrong package. Wrong packaging put onto the line as well at startup. So some challenges with label control, packaging control. And cross-contact did, like Dr. Gendel saw in his review, did have some challenges, and although more of a limited perspective as he saw in his study. So inadequate cleaning, sometimes the pre-op review wasn't conducted correctly or documented, which led to uncertainty and a recall because of that uncertainty. Now, I mentioned earlier some of those spikes that we saw, and I think those are important to highlight in this next few slides, because we think about some of the challenges and what we see in the supply chain. And those spikes really were associated with a key issue in which peanut was, cumin, ground cumin in this case, was contaminated with peanut at very high levels. And this was imported into various countries such as the US, Canada, and the EU. And here in the US, we saw well over 500 products that were product types that were associated with those recalls because it had this cumin at very high levels. So what contributed is still uncertain, potentially economically motivated adulteration from the overseas supply chain, but that's again uncertain. Additionally, what we saw is more analysis taking place to assure the integrity of the ground cumin coming in. And so there's a lot of peanut analysis conducted in which low levels were then found, likely due to commingling in the supply chain. Rather than those very high levels, we did see things such as 5, 10, 20 part per million on occasion in some of these commingled type issues. The other one that contributed in this time frame was an issue here in the US, in which we saw a mill that had brought in some, what we think was peanut meal that was brought in from shared transport vessels, such as a rail car or truck, that brought in some wheat kernels, so wheat into a mill in Georgia, and again contributed to a number of recalls of product here in the US, again potentially due to that transport issue. So again, when we think about controlling allergens, we'll talk about this in more detail. We really have a lot of challenges where we have to consider supplier verification, thinking about international supply, certainly commodity transportation, transport, and even commodity commingling can be a key issue, especially when looking towards making some type of claim, such as a free-from claim. So that really brings in the essence of what we're going to cover in the rest of the talk, focused in on really the essence of taking a hazard-based approach to evaluating where those risks may come in. And this is highlighted very nicely in the FSMA documentation and guidance, which were really focused on a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive control to assist in evaluating allergens. And with that, of course, allergens fall in that key area of chemical hazards. So certainly if they're handled in the facility or your supplier's facility, one would need to evaluate where those hazards could come in, certainly control those and identify those critical points where preventive controls could become important in the process of management. Also, not only do we have preventive controls, we have GMPs that are important in the overall process of good manufacturing, good food safety practice as well. And those will have influence on how we manage food allergens as well. So with that, I mentioned FSMA, and we have the elements of the preventive controls for human food in which allergens were very specifically called out in the document, in which we have elements of identification in a systematic allergen control program or plan, conducting those supply chain, as we'll talk about, looking at that HARP-C approach for identification. And certainly all of this does require those key elements of training. There was alongside updated GMPs, and there's mention to food allergens, but these hold true to a variety of different good manufacturing practices. So we want to think about how allergens fit into these overall GMPs, thinking about personnel and hygienic practices, garments perhaps, how we could prevent cross-contact if a risk is reasonably likely to occur there. Operations and plant construction design, thinking about elements of how we use shared equipment, shared facilities, controlling different aspects, sanitary operations, equipment, utensils that are shared, how are we maintaining the integrity of the equipment, how are we cleaning some of the equipment that we use to assure, and those utensils that are used on that shared line as well. All the way into the process control, certainly warehouse and distribution. That brings up some additional new items that are noteworthy to point to, which are a revision of the Code of Practice by Codex Alimentarius. And this was released just about a year ago now. I provided the link that it can also be available in the chat. I think this is a good, important evaluation or document to take a look at to see where, from an international perspective, Codex and others and experts are really looking at it from the management, really from a farm to fork guidance. So there's a lot of good practical guidance and general comments about how to prevent or minimize allergen cross contact in various aspects of the supply chain. And this ventures into areas of retail and food service for food business operators as well. An additional element that we see is some updates from also the Codex perspective on general principles of food hygiene. So this was also updated late last year, early this year, in which, again, there was more references to how to manage food allergens amongst other food safety issues as well. But this was the first time food allergens were more prominently called out in this document. So again, some good information on general guidance in this perspective as well. So from a effective food allergen management, we won't have time today to really cover all this aspect, but it really does instill the need to look at really every aspect of the process to adequately control allergens. So we think about that hazard identification, that HARP-C approach, anywhere from the conception and thinking about the new product design and development, bringing that product into the facility, thinking about our suppliers and supply chain challenges and risks, all the way into cleaning and validation of those cleaning procedures. And all of this really underpins the need for training, education, good communication throughout every element of the business to assure that we have buy-in and good allergen management. So with that, I think it's important to start by looking at diving into elements of allergen control. And when assembling, in my view, an allergen control or management team is a critical function when going through that hazard analysis. Bringing in individuals across the business that can speak to various elements of the supply chain, elements of operations, research and development, your cleaning sanitation team, legal, and so forth, certainly are a critical portion and aspect of this team. So you're all bringing in different insights, different perspectives that can be very valuable in the overall allergen control program. So let's just briefly jump into some of the elements where we've seen challenges. And I think let's start with product development. You know, when bringing in some of these different ingredients, certainly you want to have a good review process. You also want to think about, from that development side, if there's a functional need to utilize that allergenic ingredient. It's not to say that you can't use it. Certainly, if it's got a good functional component, if it has elements of taste or other organoleptic type properties, it provides functionality that are critical, certainly one would want to be able to use that. But if they're used at very small levels that really don't contribute, one could question, is there a need to utilize that allergenic source? Because again, what you have to think about is bringing that into the operations, which then, you know, we have to think about how we manage, schedule, clean, and so forth. Also need to think about a process to assure the facility is ready to bring that new allergen into the facility, or certainly schedule it appropriately. So critical to have that communication from the product development team to those in the pilot plant or those in the full production facility, to assure that everyone's on the same page on what that profile is and we're ready to react. We know the capabilities of the team and so forth. Supply chain management's one highlighted in FSMA, and I think, again, as you saw with some of those recalls, critical in the function of trying to assure that you have integrity of the materials being brought in. So this should be a risk-based supply chain program in which you're asking and auditing those suppliers to ensure that you understand, do they have allergens in their facility? If so, how are they managing that? Do they have a allergen control program, cleaning programs? Are they validated? And in many cases, there might be a need for verification, and that could come from an on-site audit as needed as well. So again, you want to think about different elements of where those risks could then translate into risks into your facility, and how can you minimize those. Once in your facility, I think it's appropriate to think about tracking those allergens. And one of the first steps would be mapping the allergen process, and how do you map different ingredients coming into the facility through receiving all the way through to packaging and shipment into your warehouse and out of your warehouse. So, you know, putting together a process flow so you understand how those things flow across different lines. How do your employees flow through the system? Thinking about both GMP perspectives and preventive controls. And this will help identify those key areas. So it can be pretty simplistic design. It doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be very intricate. There are tools out there, and I point only to this risk review tool provided by the Allergen Bureau of Australia and New Zealand through their VITAL program. Just as a nice illustration, this is a more online automated document in which you can go through each of those elements, and it calls out some questions that can be thought-provoking to address as you go through the process. Again, really reflecting from supply chain all the way through to labeling, packaging, and shipment of your goods. So a good tool, and there's several out there just like this. Production and operations, another key element. Again, we dive deep into it, but it's critical to think about how we're going to manage multiple allergens across a similar line, how we may think about the effects on an adjacent line. So thinking about an overall allergen matrix and a change matrix, as we have here, as published by Tim Adams in his book chapter, really gives you that element of thinking about when we need to do those changeovers, those allergen level cleans, and coupled with some of the risk review tools and hazard identification that helps guide you in identifying those key points of GMP, cleaning, preventive controls as well. Labeling and packaging, again, associated with the most reported recalls. So this is a critical need to have good document control. How do we manage obsolete labels? Do we keep them in the facility? Do we discard them? Kept in facility, are they under lock and key? Kind of similar to some of those controlled ingredients. How are we managing those from an allergen perspective? Similarly, Dr. Gendel had noticed in some of those reports, he found that some of the causes of the label issues were where the updated versions of different systems and labels weren't upgraded and implemented into online systems such as visioning systems, barcode readers, and sometimes the wrong version of a label was submitted to the labeling team that produced the labels. So again, you want to have good electronic document control as much as a good physical control as well. So one question that's come up often is, when can sesame begin to enter into the labeling process as we think about updating allergen control programs? When is it appropriate to put that on as an allergen, maybe in the contain statement? And I think in essence of food safety, I think we're going to see more of those come online and include sesame in that contain statement prior to the implementation date of January 1 of 2023. So I don't think that regulators, in the essence of safety of sesame allergic individuals, would have an issue with starting to implement that on the labels now or in the future as we're making changes. Cleaning is also important and one of the critical areas to assure that we manage cross-contact. So equipment design and complexity is always important to consider. How well can we get into the different areas of the equipment to clean, and how well can we train this so that it's done we have personnel that are very well trained, dedicated, alert, very thorough, and will do this each and every time the same way, so we can assure a validated cleaning procedure will be executed to that level of validation. So it's important not only to explain the how, but again, reiterating why it's important, and that gets a lot more buy-in in that process. So again, we have lots of different types of cleaning, anywhere from CIP systems to dry cleaning systems that really can challenge the complexity. So we have to think about the type of soils that we have and think about what capabilities are also able to be used in the cleaning perspective in the facilities. So wet cleaning, again, is it CIP, clean in place? Is it clean out of place in tanks? All of those can bring about different dynamics. Dry cleaning, again, we don't bring in water, but we're bringing in the element of a lot of physical or mechanical action, brushing, wiping, vacuuming, and so forth. Or maybe a combination where we use very limited amount of damp type, wiping, maybe steam type processes as well that don't introduce a lot of moisture, but do provide an ability to lift some of those soils. So again, the key question is, how accessible is the equipment, and be realistic. How well can you get into the equipment to clean? Should you find some challenge areas? Sometimes that's an area where you can challenge your maintenance crew to provide some upgrades or different accessibility changes to the equipment that can be quite helpful as well. When thinking about cleaning, won't go into any depth here, but really the goal is focusing on the element of that cleaning portion rather than sanitizing when we're thinking about food allergen residues and removal. So we're thinking not only about those proteins, which are the food allergens, but also having to consider what dynamic the food matrix in general brings about. So how's that, those carbohydrates and fats and lipids, minerals, how are those all playing a role in our ability to remove the protein and the biofilm surfaces as well? So again, we want to think about all of the dynamic, think about how we can dissolve, liquefy, hydrolyze, disperse, emulsify, really think about how we can carry those soils away. And again, not only from the protein perspective, but really all the elements we're dealing with within a food matrix. So once we have a removal process and we have good cleaning, we want to be able to validate that. And validation is not only what we often think about the analytical perspective, but I think the gold standard, first and foremost, is to have a good visual inspection, really getting in there, identifying, using that visual assessment to look to see if we have maybe particulate hangup, in which those particulates can cause challenge for analytical methodologies as well. So we want to have a nice combination of visual assessment and then support that also with some validation approaches that we might use, allergen-specific analytical tools, perhaps for the validation, maybe general protein type approaches for ongoing and routine verification as well. So I provided a lot in a very limited time, so I want to give a few resources that I had handy. Certainly there's a lot of great resources on effective allergen control, thinking about the essence of all of the different components I had in that wheel, and how we think about validation and verification as well. I do point to some nice resources again from the Allergen Bureau that could be utilized as well. And they've put together very nice areas for industry guides to allergen management and labeling. A nice document on where we might see unexpected allergens in different foods and ingredients based on industry experience and feedback to the Allergen Bureau. And then we're going to think about bringing that into different risk management, risk assessment tools, and likely a time for a deeper dive, but we can start to think about how we more quantitatively think about exposure and looking at what levels might contribute to allergic reaction or response. Of course, our goal is to use a very systematic and focused area to minimize the cross contact and decrease, go back and redesign, redevelop allergen control programs where we might see some deficiencies. But the VITAL program provides an element of where we begin to more quantitatively assess those areas of risks and where we might think about decision-making around precautionary allergen labeling, such as the may contains, process and facility, and those type of language. So providing a bit more transparency into the usage of that and providing some benchmark values as well. I also point to a development or a guide that kind of brings about a lot of the different elements I discussed today, and thinking about, again, quantitative assessment. So this ILSI Europe document is currently under development by a working group, getting a lot of stakeholder feedback, not only from the industry, but from consumer groups, regulatory agencies, and others. So we are looking to hopefully have a document available at the start of next year, and encourage you to take a look on the website when that might become available. So with that, I appreciate your time and certainly would be glad to open up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Baumert. What a wonderful presentation, and so grateful to have your expertise here at SQF Unites. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and we'd be happy to answer them with the remaining 5 or 6 minutes that we have. I suppose that I'll start with a question. What fascinated me about your talk was your conversation surrounding free from claims. And I'm wondering, is it advisable for companies to ever use a free from claim, or maybe even a may contain statement? Or is it better to stick with the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act required allergen label, like, you know, that contains X allergen or allergens?
Certainly. Great question, Adam, and I'll touch upon the free from to start. I think that's a separate element in which we're looking at, can we assure that we don't have any of those priority allergens such as the Big 8 or top 9 here soon to be in the US. So we don't have those as an ingredient, but they may be inherently free from, because you don't have an ingredient derived from those allergenic sources. But the challenge is really diving deep into the supply chain to evaluate where we might have the potential for cross contact, because we're making a voluntary implied communication to the allergic consumer that this does not have any of that product or any of those allergens. So with that, I think you set the bar higher when you place that free from type claim on there. With food allergens, we don't have any regulatory thresholds or action levels like we have for gluten-free label and rulemaking. So we don't have a 20 part per million benchmark. So what the reliance has been is really focused in on that supplier documentation, the evaluation of controls and facility, and then also really honing in on being below detectable limits in a food product matrix. So, you know, it takes a lot of work, and one can't overlook the various elements that I pointed to, such as supply chain, commingling. All of that can play a role if you're going to make a free from type claim. Now, precautionary allergen labeling is a different challenge, also a voluntary statement, but where those are meant to really communicate the potential risk to an allergic consumer, where despite our best efforts, again, that's the key, despite the best efforts of, you know, going through and identifying allergens in the facility, managing through GMPs, a good allergen control program and cleaning program, really the essence of a good food safety, food allergen program. You know, despite those efforts, you know, maybe there's opportunities where we might have a particulate hung up. We want to be able to communicate that risk to consumers by saying, you know, perhaps it's produced on the same line, or it may contain. You know, again, we see, unfortunately, a lot of confusion from consumers and different interpretation of all of these different types of precautionary allergen or advisory labeling. So we see anything from may contain to facility to shared line, you know, and a lot of different derivations, which in that essence has, you know, given confusion to consumers. So there's international efforts ongoing from the FAO, WHO level, hopefully feeding into Codex, to other groups such as the Allergen Bureau, and efforts by other groups in Europe, in the US, and others that are looking at how can we provide more transparency around the use, so we have better communication, better transparency for really communicating that risk to consumers and providing them with a better understanding of why they're applied, which I think is the important part as well. If they're applied, there's an inherent level of risk. One should avoid that product. And unfortunately, we do see some decision making from consumers because they're confused, trying to figure out, can I consume the product or not? So they make their own risk assessments, which can be a bit worrisome as well. We want to have that good transparency for this.
Great, thank you so much for that. So I believe that we're out of time, but I want to thank you, especially Dr. Baumert, for all of the help that you provided all of us here. There was a great discussion in the chat today, and I made sure to provide all the resources that was in your presentation today. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're going to stick around, and as you'll see, there's a breakouts tab where we can continue this discussion. Is there anything in particular, Dr. Baumert, that you think would be of good discussion for this group?
You're probably seeing more of the chat than what I can see at the moment. So be happy to stick around and highlight any of those areas that might be resonating. You know, again, I think one of the key areas is thinking about how we control allergens and some of the elements of supply chain and allergen control and facility. So we kind of did that fast and furious, as normally that's probably a 2 or 3 day activity to go through that process. So be happy to stay around and answer some more questions if there are any.
Great. Well, on behalf of SQFI, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Baumert, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today. We'll see you in the breakout rooms.